Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Waffles, I'm talking about the 2006 debut album from Trentemøller, The Last Resort. Alright then, we've finally gotten to the last request video on my current schedule, and yes, that does mean, as of right now, the Patreon schedule is finally open for requests again. I should mention that I did decide to slightly increase the price on requests. It now costs $30 to send a request in and get me to add it to my schedule. These videos have only gotten in higher and higher demand, with me getting fewer and fewer chances to actually open them because of how long it takes for me to get around to all of them. Though I did still want to keep them reasonably affordable for people, so I guess we'll see how that goes. Link to my Patreon is in the usual place in the description. Again, probably going to cap the schedule off at 12 requests before closing it again, about the amount of requests that I can typically get through over the course of 1 year. Last time these sold out in like a week. But we'll see if anything changes with the new pricing. And as always, please make sure to read all the rules for requests before sending them in. But anyway, just as this run of the schedule definitely started with a bang on that Floex album, it's also ending with a bang as well. This was a project I was particularly looking forward to covering. Anders Trentemøller, sorry for butchered pronunciations as per usual, is a well-acclaimed electronic artist from Denmark. I discovered this album by chance, I think from some random, auto-generated recommendation on iTunes many years ago. I want to say I first heard it around the time I was starting out in college, like 2014, 2015-ish, and I bumped it fairly regularly back then. The guy's mix of IDM, dub techno, and even a few edges of synth pop and alt-rock really struck me as unique and right up my alley. Even if I distinctly remember listening to the album's opener a lot more frequently than any of the other tracks, the whole project got a pretty solid amount of replay value with me back in the day. I think this artist is primarily just known for this album, and it still gets significantly more attention than anything else he put out afterwards. I'd not heard any of the guy's other albums previously, although while researching this video I did get curious enough to see what I was missing and gave his later projects a listen out of curiosity. And it did become clear very quickly that The Last Resort is really not nearly as indicative a look at the kind of artist Trentemøller really is as you would think. His later albums doubled down more and more on the rock elements of his sound, less and less about the electronics and more guitars and shoegaze and alternative rock elements and that kind of thing, and progressively less and less my personal cup of tea. I did really like his sophomore album in 2010, Into the Great Wide Yonder. That one found a good middle ground between his electronic and rock influences that still had the solid tunes to back itself up, as well as a surprising amount of stylistic variety. There's one track on there which is almost like a drill and bass banger or something, so yeah, that album's definitely worth hearing, but starting from his third album, Lost, in 2013, and going forwards, he incidentally kinda lost me. That album focused on a blend of indie rock and 80s darkwave, with a lot more vocal guests from the indie rock world brought in, which could have been interesting in theory, but the whole sound of it just kinda got tiring and unpleasant. And that would also become the style he would just settle on for all his other albums afterwards, with only slight variation. I guess Fiction in 2016 sounded more 80s with a couple of okay pop tunes. Obverse in 2019 I guess sounded more shoegazy and droney. Memoria in 2022 kind of doing the same thing as the last one, but like a little brighter and with the guitars trying to emulate New Order and The Cure more, I think. I don't know, I can't remember them too well. They all kind of run together in my mind and didn't really stand out to me. I mean, those newer albums still definitely have their fans and were all generally well reviewed as far as I can see. Maybe they hit better for people who are more indie rock minded than I am, or who are less burned out on 80s nostalgia. But I personally wasn't really impressed. Despite focusing on a supposedly poppier style, I feel like his music paradoxically got a lot less tuneful and just kind of added up to this generic brooding downer vibe with some mild 80s aesthetics that all blended into the background and stopped being fun for me to listen to. When it comes to his debut here, though, the one I'm actually supposed to review, even if you ignore the fact that the more IDM-ish style of it happens to be a lot more attuned to my personal taste, or that I've had so many more years of familiarity with it, it's just in a whole other ballpark of quality from all his other stuff. This is the big classic that he's always going to be remembered by, and right from my first return listen for this video, it held up even a lot better than my vague memories of it had led me to believe. Not to say I think this album is necessarily perfect either, or that I don't have my issues, but this album was a lot more consistent than I remembered, with more of the ability to be in that all-timer conversation than I may have initially gave it credit for back in the day. Now, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the main thing that always stuck out in my mind the most about this album over the years was its opening track, Take Me Into Your Skin. This was always such a total showstopper way for the album to start, and just like immediately knocked my socks off from the first time I heard it nearly a decade ago. It's this 7.5-minute mini opus that starts out with all these low-key mixes of reversed electric pianos and light IDM percussion, and gradually and naturally building up from near ambience into some super propulsive epic soundscapes, complete with washed out guitars and heavy bass, a brief change up in the middle that changes the key and turns into like a dreamy pop rock instrumental, with the guitars almost taking on like a tiny bit more of a, I guess, a country-ish flavor, and even some strings getting added into the mix. The climax at the end is all abrasive bass synths and this big crashing drum solo. The whole track was nothing short of mind-blowing for me back then, and always makes those 7.5 minutes feel like they zip by as if it was nothing, fully keeping me on the edge of my seat the entire time. I listened to that one track on its own so much back in the day, to the point where I may have even overplayed it, leading to its impact having been lessened for me now, and I didn't really have any new insight to glean from it listening to it right now that I didn't already get out of it years ago. It is still my favorite track on the album, but the nice thing about having my feelings so well cemented there is that it actually made it all the easier to appreciate the rest of the album and realize the gap in quality between the opener and all the other tracks was a lot narrower than I thought. The whole run of tracks that immediately follows is also great in lots of separate and completely different ways. Take the second track, Vamp, for instance, which builds itself entirely around one really thick and rocking electric bass line. It's a much simpler track that may not have nearly as many moving parts to it. Just that simple swung beat with some occasional glitch effects and the bass line occasionally getting more or less distorted, but that bass does really effectively make for a memorable hook, and even when I hadn't listened to this album in years, it was still not a moment I was ever going to forget. Really kicks ass in spite of how somewhat low-key and simplistic it is. Meanwhile, you also got a track like Evil Dub, which may not really have any kind of hook, but definitely further expands the amount of styles the album aimed to explore. As you might guess, it focuses on more of a dub techno kind of style. It's very low-end heavy, with some steady and straightforward low-key beat work, a few little echoing guitar licks to give everything that more obvious dub flavor, maybe a couple of barely audible beeping synth melodies, and of course that whole passage in the second half which brings that crunchy electric bass back in and kicks the beats up into a higher gear. Definitely a track that lives up to its title both in the dub sense and the evil sense of how dark and menacing everything sounds. Really satisfying stuff once again for sure. Now, if these last two cuts might have left you wishing for something with, I guess, a bit more melody, the next two cuts have you covered. Always Something Better really stands out from the crowd immediately in all its warmer electric piano and even kind of music box-ish melodies going up against more dark and brooding IDM percussion mixes and glitches and wobbly bass textures. A track that, despite being just as dark and melancholic as any other track here, makes that deeper emotional core all the easier to connect with. Also, there's a cool section at one point where the bass takes on a lot more of an acid-ish texture, and there's a whole, like, DJ scratching solo, which somehow does not feel out of place. And some of the ways guitars and strings are used on this track, especially near the end, give me similar vibes to something that might show up on, like, I don't know, Air's 10,000 Hertz Legend. Excellent track. And right after that, we get another equally big emotional highlight in While the Cold Winter Waiting. A lot of this track is building itself on warm and mildly shoegazy ambient soundscapes with light glitchy percussion tapping on top, but there's also a bit of like a jazzier bend to this one in the way some light live drumming and vibraphone is added in the mix. Also not getting into the more intimate section of guitar and glockenspiel melodies, or the touches of melodica for that warmer and more homespun effect, or that other section which just glitches everything up in the mix in a way that mildly reminds me of the kind of thing fellow Danish IDM producer Rumpistol was doing around that time. It's a lot more positive and comforting than anything else on the album, just makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, like sitting next to a fireplace during a snowstorm. Though from there we get right back into the more dub techno flavored stuff as we move into following track Nightwalker, which sticks more firmly to the established dub techno formulas which artists like Basic Channel set for him before than any other track here. From the beat work to the blipping synths to the echoing effects, also the sparse spoken vocal samples talking about music is a big prayer. No major twists on the formulas of this genre we already know, but it does this sound very well, and in a way that I found pretty immediately striking on return listen. And then if you wanted something that sticks a bit more to the sound that Trentemøller is known for specifically, we then also get Like Two Strangers, which is, I guess, maybe the most rock-flavored cut in the bunch? Maybe. There's lots of atmospheric and shoegazy guitar effects that have a particularly stormy quality to them. The way those bursts of guitar distortion go up next to the more atmospheric guitar pads and Celeste and music box melodies with even some cello on the side at one point evoke watching like a thunder and lightning storm raging on from the comfort of your home. Now, I will admit that this entire first half of the album so far is markedly better than the second half, and it is immediately after this point that the album's pacing noticeably slows down, and we get what I believe to be the album's two weakest tracks, which, to be fair, are also still quite good in their own right, but, you know, they're just kind of sluggish and don't stand out or hit as much as the cuts that came before. The sort of titled track, The Very Last Resort, is the album's longest track at 8.5 minutes, and floats through Spanish-tinged guitar arpeggios, wailing surf guitars, and lots of echoing dub percussion with live drumming. Still does a good job of maintaining the album's immersively brooding vibe and delivers some interesting sounds, especially if you're more into that dubbier side of the album's sound. But it definitely has a tendency to just kind of meander on without really feeling like it's going anywhere or progressing much. And then we get to Snowflake, which starts out with the exact same blend of melodic textures as heard in the beginning of Take Me Into Your Skin, but building those mixes into something very different and much lower key. A lot more of like an ambient down-tempo piece that sticks to its one mix of atmospheric synths with some dubby bass and much lighter percussion. That once again has a tendency to just meander on without really going anywhere special over the course of its 7.5 minutes. The most notable progression is this kind of quirky set of not really TB303 synths that start to take a lot more of the focus in the second half. Again, it's a nice track, and the way it reprises some of the opener's ideas while twisting them into something new is a decently creative idea, but it's obviously not nearly as good as Take Me Into Your Skin, and it is probably the single moment on the album that feels the most like it is just padding out the album's runtime. The rest of the album from this point onwards is also mostly made up out of tracks which don't have quite the same level of textural complexity or progression as the tracks in the first half do, but we do get more tracks that are able to make like better use of their more straightforward simplicity. Following track Chameleon, for instance, just goes like full-on minimal techno, stripping itself back more than any other cut here, pretty much just to brooding bass and beats with a few IDM glitches and synth effects just kind of acting as window dressing more than anything, not really meant to grab your attention much. I think this cut might have been my least favorite back in the days when I first heard this album, but it's grown on me a lot returning to it for this video. The whole thing gives me very similar vibes to something that might show up on an album like Plastic Man's Consumed, which is particularly cool, and there's certainly way more progression to this track than anything on that album. And speaking of minimal techno that gives me a little bit of Plastic Man Consumed vibes, albeit in a very different way, next we get Into the Trees, Serenetti Part 3, which I think delivers some similar ideas in a way that feels even more exciting and probably has the most of a sense of progression or depth out of any of the tracks in the second half. Got a lot of those eerie synth string melodies that you could hear on moments like the title track on Consumed, along with the brooding bass and straightforward techno beats. But there's also a lot more interesting textures being piled on top in various other parts, from guitars to strings to live drumming that has much more of a marching tone to it. This is definitely the kind of track that keeps you guessing where it might be going next with how much it evolves and changes. I think this stands as my favorite track in the whole second half of the album. And that finally takes us to the album's ending with what I believe are its two most popular singles. First we got penultimate cut Moan, which is definitely a track I go back and forth with a lot. It does mark the return of that warmer IDM sound that Trentemøller is more known for, with a lot of moody and minor key but well-enveloping synth melodies, alongside more guitars and glitchy percussion. The way some of the pizzicato strings are introduced give me Rum Pistol vibes once again and kind of remind me of that guy's track Two Lone Swampsons. Also, I quite like how this track introduces some mellotronish strings at the end. But still, something about this track just never quite clicked with me to the point where it became as much of a highlight as I think it was supposed to be. Its melodic hooks aren't the strongest, and I think the ideas explored on this track might be explored more effectively on other tracks earlier on this album, such as Always Something Better. Still a really good track, but I keep feeling like I'm supposed to be getting into it more than I actually am, because of how much it was pushed as a single and stuff, I don't know. But that leaves the album's closer in what seems to be the most popular track out of them all, Miss You. And yeah, I can definitely see why so many people gravitated towards this one, because it's basically just a Boards of Canada track. It's nothing but extremely minimal synth blips and electric pianos that remind me a lot of the opening moments of their track Turquoise Hexagon Sun. Still very effectively hitting on that sentimental and longing atmosphere that BOC's best minimal synth interludes are able to hit upon, while sounding much sonically cleaner and clearer and less lo-fi than the stuff that duo's typically associated with. Very understated way for this album to be closing out, but definitely hits on that minimalistic effect it's going for, and makes for a satisfying finish to this whole experience. And that's finally everything on The Last Resort. Well, almost. Certain versions of this album also add on an entire second bonus disc of material, which mainly compiles together a whole bunch of loose singles and B-sides he put out before the album, as well as vocal versions of the tracks Always Something Better and Moan, featuring Richard Davis and Anne Trolle, respectively. I don't actually really have anything to say about any of the material on the bonus CD, though it will serve you well if you're looking for him to explore a lot more of the really straightforward techno side of his sound. Like, Chameleon was included a second time, because that was also an earlier B-side first, but that track does set the tone for a lot of the other material on that bonus CD. It's just really standard early 2000s tech house fare that goes pretty hard, sounds very crisp, and hits on all the danceable formulas you'd want out of that genre, although isn't the most memorable or makes for nearly as good a showcase of what makes Trentemøller style in particular so unique, kind of just showing him blending more into the tech house crowd without having really carved out his own lane yet. Also, the vocal versions of the album tracks are neither better or worse than their original instrumental counterparts. Richard Davis does add more of a hook to Always Something Better that makes the track all the easier to remember, but also the track didn't really need him to work, and I think is kind of more effective without him, honestly. And the addition of vocals to Moan, they make sense, but do absolutely nothing to change my opinion of the track one way or the other. But that's finally everything on The Last Resort. So, yeah, I mean, this album is already well celebrated as an all-time classic in the IDM world, and I'm not about to disagree with any of that. I think that hype is well deserved. There are definitely parts of the album that have hit quite a bit more for me than others, and the whole project can run on a bit long for its own good at 77 minutes total. It's not exactly the kind of project that leaves me itching to jump right back into it after it's done. In fact, it's the kind of project that's easy to personally overplay, as it can give a lot of immediate appeal in all of its unique and emotionally resonant blends of IDM and techno and rock and synthpop and whatnot that feel really deep and expansive, but maybe end up with that brooding and downbeat vibe wearing out a bit the more frequently I put it on. At least that's my personal experience of it. I listened to it a lot at that one very specific point in my life and then kind of left it by the wayside for years without really thinking about it much. And a lot of the times I put it on for this video, I would often need a break at the end of it. But still, after coming back to it for this video and really taking all of it in multiple times, even with all those issues still intact, it was a lot better and more consistent than I remembered, and even the lowest points and least interesting moments still provide plenty to like. The particular mix of styles and executions is still pretty singular in the greater world of electronic music. There's plenty of variety, and there's more than enough absolutely outstanding material on display here to really cement this project's classic status. It's one of the prime examples of amazing IDM projects to come out of the mid-2000s, and if your taste is anything like mine, I would definitely say it's an essential listen. I'm overall feeling an 8.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, or make me review something. Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.